The Caribbean, October 1492. 3 ships flying a Spanish flag, a magnetic compass on the table, hand-drawn maps. The total backing of Europe's most powerful royalty. Christopher Columbus steps onto a tiny beach in the Bahamas, fully convinced he just hit the coast of Asia. He is entirely on the wrong continent. The man will cross this ocean 4 more times, and he will die without ever realizing where he actually stood. Now rewind almost 500 years. Newfoundland, the year 1021, a single Viking ship, no compass, no map, no royal armada, 35 men freezing in an open hull. And they know exactly where they are. These Norse explorers will build on this beach, forge iron and chop timber. Then they will do something Columbus never even considered. They pack their tools and leave, on purpose. This is how Viking survival systems reached America 5 centuries before the rest of Europe knew it existed. 2 ships, 2 completely different systems. One had an empire funding it, the other brought something better, and the final clue rewrites the historical timeline completely. To grasp what these Norsemen actually pulled off, you have to stand where they stood, not in Scandinavia. We are in Greenland, the year 985. Eric the Red, a man exiled from Iceland for murdering his neighbor, sails 25 ships west. Calling the place Greenland was pure marketing. He knew exactly what he was selling. Only 14 ships actually made it, the survivors of the survivors. These tough few became the founding population of the pioneers hitting America. By the late 10th century, 2 small settlements barely clung to Greenland's southwest coast. At their peak, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people total. A single village, pinned against a massive ice sheet, 3,000 kilometers from anywhere, but this next detail explains everything. Greenland had almost 0 trees, but Norse civilization ran entirely on wood. Every single house, barn, and ship needed timber. No timber means no ships means no iron, you are trapped. Now you might be thinking, what about driftwood? Yes. Nearly half of Greenland's wood drifted over from Siberian rivers, floating across the Arctic Ocean. But driftwood is dead wood. Months soaking in salt water makes it dangerously brittle. For a solid ship keel, you need living timber. Greenland had none of that. This isolated Norse colony was on a ticking clock. The popular myth says someone got lucky and stumbled into North America. The evidence says otherwise, around 986. A Norse merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson got blown completely off course heading to Greenland. He spotted a heavily forested coastline, but refused to land. The man was searching for his father, not exploring unknown shores, so he turned around. But he reported the sighting, 15 years later. Erik the Red's son Leif bought Bjarni's actual ship. He didn't build a new one. He took that identical vessel and retraced the route backward. 3 landfalls, Helluland. The land of flat stones, Markland the land of forests, Vinland the land of wine. 4 distinct expeditions launched over 20 years, each crew building on the last voyage. Columbus sailed once on a wild hunch and got lucky. These Vikings were running pure reconnaissance, and this is where the Norse engineering really matters. 2 ships, same ocean, 2 entirely different systems for surviving it. Let's start with the Santa Maria, 18 meters long, 100 tons. A deep keel dropping over 2 meters below the waterline, heavy, very stable in rolling swells, built for deep blue water. Columbus commanded a 3-ship fleet, and the Santa Maria was his proud flagship. The largest, the most famous, the one actually carrying the captain. Now picture a Norse knarr. 16 meters long, 25 tons, with a draft of just about 1.5 meters. That is roughly a quarter of the Santa Maria's heavy tonnage, clinker built. Overlapping oak planks pinned with iron rivets, sealed tight with tarred animal hair. The hull never fights the wave, it bends and flexes right with it. We broke down the mechanics of that hull flex in our Roman ships video, but let's be extremely clear here, a knarr is absolutely not a longship. Longships were designed strictly for war. The knarr was the heavy cargo hauler. This specific ship design literally built the Norse Atlantic. Now, watch what actually happens when each of these vessels finally hits a coastline. On Christmas Eve, 1492, the mighty Santa Maria ran hard aground onto a shallow reef right off the coast of modern-day Haiti. Not during a raging storm, in dead calm water, the massive ship that conquered the Atlantic Ocean couldn't handle a simple sandbar. Her hull snapped. Columbus was forced to abandon her right there on the beach, ripping apart her timbers to construct a fort. He sailed home on a much smaller boat, the flagship of Europe's most legendary voyage, never sailed again. The greatest navigator of his entire generation lost his own ship within just 10 weeks of reaching the Americas, and nobody ever talks about that detail. A Norse knarr does not have that fatal flaw. Pulling just 1.5 meters of draft, you can drive her straight up onto a sandy beach. Tilt her right onto her side and camp under the hull as a winter windbreak. Come spring, the rising tide and a few strong men push her right back into the water. Same ship, no dry dock, no deep port, no empire needed. This is exactly why Meadows sits where it does. A nice shallow bay, a wide flat shore. The absolute perfect spot to haul a heavy knarr out of the freezing water. These Norsemen weren't picking a colony site, they were choosing a safe garage for their ship. The Spanish Navy relied on specialized, brute power. The Norse Atlantic ran purely on adaptability. One ship came home in pieces, the other kept sailing home for 300 years. But adaptability only gets you across the open water. It doesn't tell you where you are once you hit land. The physical ship is only half the story. Knowing your exact location is the other half, and this is exactly where the skill gap between Columbus and the Norse gets almost embarrassing. How these Vikings crossed the open ocean without a magnetic compass is its own wild story. We actually broke that down in another video on this channel. The legendary sunstone, the shadow board, the strict bird logic. By the year 1000, Norse navigators could hit a target coastline within a single day's sail of their mark. Open ocean navigation was already a fully solved problem. The brutal challenge was what Vinland actually posed, an entirely unknown coastline with zero maps. You learn it the way a modern spec ops team scouts hostile terrain, one slow survey at a time, gathering hard intelligence before making any major commitment. Bjarne's accidental sighting in 986 gave them that first real piece of intelligence. There was absolutely something out there. Leif's expedition around the year 1000 turned that sighting into hard geography. 3 coastlines logged in order, each name an intelligence report. Helluland meant stone. Markland meant timber, Vinland meant grass and grapes. Soon, a second wave sailed back to test the grid that the first crews mapped. Could you survive the winter, set up trade routes, hold the ground? This wasn't some mythic treasure hunt, it was a cold, calculated survey program. Light, fast, repeatable. Picture a Norse navigator on his second run to Markland. He memorized the exact shape of the bays from the veteran who trained him, who learned it from the guy who first spotted them. No paper charts existed. The map lived entirely in his head, and that mental grid got sharper with every single Atlantic crossing. Now look at the contrast. Columbus ran 4 missions to the Caribbean over 11 years. He died convinced he just found a backdoor to Asia. He mapped a brand new sea and named it the wrong ocean. So how far south did these Viking explorers push? Meadows is the northernmost verified base. Yet the butternuts dug up there don't grow within hundreds of kilometers of Newfoundland. Someone hauled them back from way further down the American coastline. Some experts claim Norse crews hit the Gulf of Maine. Others draw the line at the St. Lawrence. Honestly, 3 solid centuries of logging operations don't run out of one isolated base camp. Where do you stand on this? Because for 900 years, nobody bought the sagas. Academics just called them campfire hero tales with sprinkled geography. No serious historian expected to dig up hard proof. Then, in 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Stad and his wife, the archaeologist Steining Stad, hit the northern tip of Newfoundland. A local fisherman points them to some weird grassy mounds sitting near a shallow bay. Nobody knows who built them. The Ingstads grab shovels. What comes out of that dirt completely rewrites the discovery of the Americas. Sod walls packed over heavy timber frames. A building spec anyone from a Norse Greenland farm would recognize in a heartbeat. A working smithy full of iron slag. Hard proof that someone was smelting bog iron and pounding out nails on this very beach. A bronze cloak pin, dead obvious Scandinavian gear, and a spindle whorl, a tiny tool but it flips the script. Spindle whorls mean spinning. Spinning means women were present. This wasn't some hit-and-run raiding camp. This was a true settlement with families. But here's the kicker that proves this site wasn't actually Vinland. The team unearthed butternuts. That tree's northern limit is way down in the St. Lawrence Valley, hundreds of kilometers away from this exact spot. Somebody shipped them back north. This camp was never the final destination. It was a forward operating base. A shallow bay for dragging up longships, a forge pumping out repair rivets. Nothing screams we're staying forever. Everything points to we are running operations from right here. Over 800 physical artifacts came out of that dirt. These Norsemen crossed the Atlantic without a single paper chart, leaving behind enough evidence to pack a museum. Turns out, finding America was never really the hardest part. The struggle was proving to everyone it actually happened. For decades, one massive question hung around: when exactly did the Norse land? Radiocarbon dating spit out around the year 1000, plus or minus 50 years, nowhere near sharp enough. Then in 2021, a research squad at the University of Groningen figured out how to pin that date down to a single, specific year. They studied 3 chunks of wood from the dig site, all scarred by metal blade chops. The secret key was a cosmic event nobody on Earth even felt in 993. That exact year, a brutal solar storm blasted the planet with charged particles. This radiation blast burned a specific spike into tree rings globally. A hard cosmic timestamp scarred into every living tree at the exact same instant. The Groningen crew spotted that 993 anomaly in all 3 wood samples. Then they just counted outward, 28 growth rings straight to the bark. 993 plus 28 equals the year 1021. 3 separate trees, 1 hard date, the sharpest timeline in all of pre-Columbian history. The sagas weren't campfire myths, they were raw history, so they hit Vinland. They built a fort, forged iron tools, but here is the major survival question almost nobody asks outright: why didn't these settlers just stay? The pop history version says the locals chased them out. The hard archaeological evidence says otherwise. The math just didn't work out. The Norse sagas called the locals Skraelings. It definitely wasn't meant as a compliment. These were likely the ancestors of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, or related indigenous tribes who successfully held that Atlantic coastline for thousands of years. That initial contact was highly cautious. The Greenland Saga actually describes these Norse colonists trading simple strips of red cloth for heavy winter furs. Both sides stayed alert, both sides made a profit. For a quick minute, the system worked. If you've ever been the outsider in a completely unfamiliar room, where a simple nod means safety, but one wrong twitch ruins everything, you get the absolute tension of those early trades. The Norse were balancing that deadly tension 3,000 miles away from any backup. Then the fragile piece snapped. Somebody grabbed a weapon. A man dropped dead. Leif Erikson's own brother Thorvald took a native arrow, becoming the first known European killed in combat on North American soil. What happened next was the most aggressive Norse push to lock down the continent. And the brutal choice that ruined it exposes why Vinland was truly abandoned. By the way, if you love this level of history, dropping a like really helps out. Thorfinn Karlsefni landed with 70 people, aiming for permanent settlement. Women, livestock, everything. Trade restarted, then quickly crashed. The Norse possessed iron tools, the locals wanted them. Karlsefni suddenly faced a brutal choice with 0 good answers. Hand over weapons, trade iron, and arm the exact locals who could wipe out his Viking settlement, or refuse and kill trade. He refused. The fighting came back. Here is where the survival math really hit home. Greenland had maybe 2,500 Norse settlers total. Karlsefni brought just 70 over to Vinland. That is 1/35 of everyone, kids included, but in an outpost unable to replace one lost crew. Losing 70 lives was a gamble the Norse simply could not take. 2,500 kilometers of iceberg stood between him and backup. Columbus had the Spanish Empire backing him. The crown could easily eat the cost of a sunken ship and send 3 more. The Norse could not replace 70 people, 3,000 miles, 0 backup. Karlsefni ran that brutal math every single morning. He was not running from failure. He was executing a complex sustainability analysis just without the spreadsheet. How they packed up proves this perfectly. They left no burned camps, no fresh graves. Instead, they took apart what they could, packed the ships, and literally yanked the iron nails out of the walls. Back in Greenland, a handful of iron rivets held more value than the actual timber they secured. You really want to understand Viking engineering priorities. Watch exactly what they dragged back home. Anybody who has ever killed a working project just because the long-term math simply did not add up gets the burden. Karlsefni felt. He was not retreating. He was respecting the cold, hard numbers. That logic might be the most Viking thing in this whole saga. Most accounts of Norse America stop flat at Elant's Ox Meadows, but here is what nobody ever mentions. In 1126, on Greenland's southwest coast, medieval masons started laying red sandstone blocks for a massive cathedral, 27 meters long. Featuring stained glass, a bell tower, all dedicated to Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors. 366 years before Columbus touched a Caribbean beach, the very first Christian cathedral in the Western Hemisphere stood tall on North American soil. They called it Gardar, and the massive timber holding up its roof came from a wild forest the rest of medieval Europe had no clue existed. In 2023, an Icelandic archaeologist named Lisbeth Guðmundsdóttir published research on over 8,000 wood pieces from medieval Norse Greenland. 26 of them were hemlock and jack pine, two tree species with a geographic footprint as exact as a passport. Neither tree grew in Europe. Neither could just drift naturally across the ocean. To get that specific wood into Greenland buildings, human hands chopped it down, and Norse cargo ships hauled it across the Davis Strait, and the dates on those specific fragments span 3 whole centuries. The Vikings were not just making one famous, legendary trip. They operated a transatlantic timber supply chain for longer than the United States has even existed as a nation. There is just one written record of these crossings. In 1347, an Icelandic historical chronicle mentions a small ship, carrying 17 men, hitting Iceland after getting severely blown off course. They had sailed from Greenland over to Markland for lumber, and here is what that medieval writer actually found newsworthy. He did not care that Norse crews were sailing to North America. That was just Tuesday. The big news was simply the ship getting blown wildly off course. By 1347, sailing to the Americas for timber was so incredibly boring that the only reason it made history was a navigation error. So why does history remember Columbus and totally ignore the Norse? It is not about who got there first. The archaeological evidence is settled there. It is entirely about what survived the trip home. Columbus had an industrial printing press waiting in Europe to blast out his discovery. A rich monarchy bankrolling return trips. The Norse had firelight. Ancient sagas held in memory, not locked on paper. Every modern family carries something like this, a quiet skill living in someone's hands. A rich story that just dies with the final person who could tell it right. The Vikings lost an entire hemisphere exactly that way. Not because their survival systems failed, but because the men telling the tale died out before the printing press existed. This channel exists for the historical stories denied their credit, the engineering, the raw discipline, the intelligence behind how these explorers crossed an ocean and walked away from a whole continent with their dignity totally intact. If that is the kind of real history you came here to uncover, you know exactly what to do. The true measure of an explorer is not whether he stays, it is whether he actually understands what he found. Columbus hit a whole continent and confidently called it the wrong name. The Norse reached it, named it correctly, mapped the coast, harvested it for 300 years, and eventually walked away with their iron discipline intact. One of those men got the statues, the other got the absolute truth.